Hey everybody, I am not going to put together a big ridiculous video this week because frankly I think you've got a lot to watch already. However, very quickly I want to introduce our topic and give you just a little bit of background information. Skip that, let's get down to business. Some questions about global migration. What's the situation today? Who migrates? How many people? From where? To where? And how does that compare with how things were in the past? And also, since we are here together in the United States, a country that prides itself on its tradition of welcoming your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Now that I'm actually reading that, it sounds kind of offensive and maybe a little racist. Anyway, how do we compare with other destination countries? According to the United Nations, in 2013, there were about 230 million international migrants worldwide. Now, that is a big number. And over the past 50 years, it has been rising significantly. In fact, even as the world's population has exploded, the percentage of that population living in a country other than where they were born has continued to rise. So is there more immigration today than ever before? Well, in absolute numbers, yeah, sure. But that might just be because there are more people around than ever before. We're certainly in the middle of a global migration boom right now. But the history of human migration booms goes all the way back to the dawn of, history. In particular, there was a significant era of global mass migration between the 1860s and about the 1930s. Now, everybody is familiar already with one major component of this. About 55 to 60 million Europeans crossed the Atlantic and settled in the United States, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, blah, 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 blah. However, over that same period, there were two other mass migrations on about the same scale. One was from southern China and India into Southeast Asia. Another was from Russia, northern China, Japan, and Korea into Manchuria, Siberia, the Russian Far East, and Central Asia. It's really hard to make apples-to-apples comparisons between that earlier migration boom and this one. But we can probably say that relative to population, they were both at least in the same ballpark. So what's happening today isn't completely unprecedented. Today, the largest numbers of international migrants come from India, Mexico, Russia, China, and Bangladesh. Interestingly, these countries are not by any means the poorest of the poor. With the possible exception of Bangladesh, they're all pretty solidly middle-income countries. And that tells us that migration requires resources. If you are a young, ambitious, well-educated person living in Shanghai or Mumbai, then migrating to a developed country might not be easy, but it's possible, and it's a good way of improving your life prospects. However, if you are desperately poor, uneducated, and living in the slums of Lagos or Kinshasa, then you have a much harder road ahead of you just to get something like a passport. So how about the major destinations for international migrants? Here, the United States is way out in front. We have over 45 million immigrants living in this country, about 20% of the world's total, more than 4 times as many as the next highest country, Russia. So we win, right? We are the all-time world champions of immigration. USA! 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 Settle down, settle down. We do have a lot of immigrants in this country, but relative to our population, we do not have the highest percentage of foreign-born residents. In fact, we're not even in the top 10. Now, you can make the argument that some of these are just unfair comparisons. There are a lot of very small, very wealthy countries that import large numbers of low-wage guest workers, grant them very few rights, and then make it virtually impossible for them to become citizens or even permanent residents. That's not really what we're talking about when we say immigration, right? Well, sort of. However, even if you get rid of all those countries, you still can't argue with the fact that countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada have totally got us beat in the immigration department. Canada. Finally, from an economic point of view, who benefits from migration and who maybe suffers? I'm actually going to leave those questions hanging right now. They're very well covered in your readings, so let's get into it in the discussion thread, and I won't say anything about it here.